This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, November 15th edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back with you alongside the usual crew, back in the Brooklyn bunker, I should say, alongside the usual crew. On my right, from the DRF offices in New York City, we have Mike Hogan.
Hello, Pete. Welcome back.
Thank you. And coming to us from an undisclosed location deep in the heart of Texas, we have JK himself, Jonathon Kinchen. JK, what up?
Oh, what's going on? What's going on, fellas? Yeah, I'm home, so it's nice. It's nice to be here.
We're all back in our normal places now. Folks out there are probably like, how come these jokers didn't do a post-Breeders' Cup recap? Well, let me tell you, folks, I arranged my vacation schedule specifically so we could do just that. We did actually record, if not broadcast, a show last week, 1 week ago, I guess, on Tuesday, from my bunker in Silver Lake. But, alas, technology problems. We were struck down only to have the second lost podcast in the history of the DRF Players Podcast. Mike, what was the situation for people out there who are curious?
Well, the long and short of it was I was holed up in a quiet spot running the recording through Citrix, which is what I usually do the webinars through. I was on Wi-Fi, not wired. It sounded fine amongst all three of us, but my computer through the Wi-Fi was cutting in and out intermittently. So the recording would be fine for a minute or two, and then it would drop out for 30 seconds. And it was ultimately kind of unlistenable. But it's okay because we only got Jonathon for half an hour. We were a little bit rushed. I welcome the chance to get another chance at it.
I don't disagree, because let me tell you, I'm not exaggerating when I say the first lost podcast that we ever did, back when that was, I remember I was in Santa Anita, so it must have been one of the Santa Anita contests. That was a truly great show that I felt horrible that we lost, because we had a lot of really good discussions, most of which I think we were subsequently able to recreate in future podcasts. But last Tuesday's show, I was pretty darn burned out from running around at the Breeders' Cup. I think my hosting was subpar, frankly. And like you said, Mike, we only had Jonathon for half the show anyway. So, probably just as well that one will be in the dustbin. Hopefully we can do a lot better job today. Have to say, I really did enjoy my first real vacation days in the 3 years since I started working here. Granted, made them a busman's holiday by going to Del Mar during their contest, no less. But I was very conscious while I said hi to players and everything. I was not doing any reporting, laid off social media, just really wanted to enjoy some days in the sun with the family. And the trip did nothing to diminish my love of Del Mar. I mean, the fall meet, very different vibe. But boy, it's that whole area, North County, San Diego, it's a special place where I hope to spend a whole bunch more time in the future. Mike, when you were out in LA, did you spend much time at Del Mar?
I didn't. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before. I've actually never been to Del Mar. We just never really went down to that part. I don't think I ever really ventured further south than Disneyland. Because my family ultimately had no reason to.
Right. No, I suppose that makes sense. But JK, you're with me on Del Mar as a pretty special place potentially for like family vacation / degeneracy at the racetrack.
Yeah, I actually think it's probably the best. There's so many surrounding like towns and cities where you can do things. There's obviously the San Diego Zoo, which is it's one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. So you can kind of parlay the trip to the racetrack with the beach, the city, and all that other good stuff. So I'm a big fan.
Yeah, we had a beach day in there, which was fantastic. We were just staying at that Courtyard by Marriott right there, and sort of a fun pool. It was a beautiful situation, and I kind of thought I would want to detach from racing more than I was going to, but between my daughter's desire to go to the track and then the Pick Six carryover on Sunday, I ended up parking there 2 full days. But it was very enjoyable, and I have to say it made me very proud / scared for my daughter's future when, as we were driving by Del Mar Racetrack one last time to head to the airport, a tear came to her eye, and she said, "I miss the racetrack, Daddy." I told her it's okay. I'll take you to Aqueduct, and my wife said, "Don't do that. Don't do that."
It's the same thing. It's the same thing.
Oh, all right. Let's talk Breeders' Cup, guys. It's been a long time. We've had a little bit of time for history to settle in at this point. And history, I think, is the right word. I mean, I've been following racing closely for 20 years, so I've had about 20 Breeders' Cups under my belt. For me, this was the best one I've seen. And so I'll start by asking you, Jonathan, is that just hyperbole, or was this really something special we witnessed at Santa Anita over the 4th and 5th of November?
No, I think it was remarkable. I think, obviously the two big races on Friday and Saturday with the Chrome and Arrogate and Songbird and Beholder, those two races will obviously go down as some of the best in those scenarios and those two races. And so I think those two races were phenomenal. But let's not forget the all the other great moments, with Tourist and Tepin running at Tourist late, and Highland Reel wiring the field, and the Classic Empire and Not This Time, and I'm probably missing even closer photos that have just slipped my mind, but it felt like every race was close. Lady Eli, exactly.
Lady Eli, yeah.
And Queen's Trust, how exciting of a finish that was. I thought it was remarkable. The weather's great. Santa Anita always puts on a great show, and it was definitely the best that I've seen.
It was pretty exciting. There's no two ways about it. And I think we don't want to give any of those races short shrift, but I will ask you, Mike, a macro question about the 2 days in general, just to get you to weigh in. You've been a racing fan for about as long as I have. Do you feel confident in calling this the greatest, if not one of the greatest Breeders' Cups of all time?
I think so. And here's why. Because we talked so much about Beholder and Stellar Wind and Songbird leading up to the race. We talked so much about Chrome versus Arrogate. We talked so much about so many of these marquee matchups, Lady Eli and the Euros, Found, where's she going to go? And so many of those times when you talk up races like that, it just leads to some disappointment. There's a one horse that's clearly the best. The race doesn't play out the way you're hoping it will. This was a case where no matter how much we talked up any of these races, it was still even better than I could have imagined. And it wasn't just one race that was like that. It was the whole weekend. You get race after race of just fantastic finishes, amazing performances. So yeah, it's not hyperbole.
I heard some people reflecting a little bit of disappointment just in the fact that you had these close calls / tough beats for the likes of Tepin and Songbird and Lady Eli. But to me, and Jonathan, I'll get your take on this, I didn't feel like any of those runners really lost anything in defeat. I'm on record as saying I'm not a person who's obsessed with undefeated records or always seeing horses win. I believe it's better for the sport to see our superstars tested and show their mettle, whether they win or lose. Am I just making excuses, or how do you feel about these racing superstars who just found one better this weekend?
Yeah, and I think if you think of all the second place finishers in some of the big races, Not This Time, California Chrome, Songbird, Lady Eli, Ohm, Tepin. I mean, those horses, in my opinion, the way that they ran proved that they're as good as we thought they were. And the ones that are going to continue to race, I think that we're going to continue to see great things out of them. So it wasn't that moment of disappointment where there was some horse that was built up to be something, and then after Friday and Saturday, you don't feel nearly as good about that horse. I think Lady Eli proved herself, and so it's definitely it's a different situation than I think it normally is when you have these second place finishers that you kind of want to give a hard time for not getting the job done. Doesn't seem like that was the case this week or a couple weekends ago.
I didn't feel that way either. Let's start by talking about the distaff, the big race on Friday. We got to see the showdown we wanted to see. It was billed as a race between the big three. It ended up being more about the big two, but with a possible asterisk for that. I know, Mike, you had a theory about how you viewed the distaff could come down to which race call you listened to.
Well, yeah, and I don't know if you guys had a chance to go back and compare each of the two race calls, but if you heard Larry Colmus on NBC the first thing he mentions is the poor break from Stellar Wind, and he mentions it a couple times, and then he gets into the race and starts calling it. If you watch Michael Rona's, or if you listen to Michael Rona's call, he mentions Songbird breaks beautifully, Beholder breaks well. He doesn't mention Stellar Wind at all. And so I think it's an example of what you're potentially looking for and how you're going into the race and what you're expecting. No knock on either one of them. They both called a fantastic race in their own way. But if you're expecting Stellar Wind to be a player, then you're going to notice that break. If you're expecting Songbird to get the lead and you're expecting Beholder to break well, it maybe doesn't matter what Stellar Wind does out of the gate. So it was an interesting thing to me because I didn't realize it until I went back and watched the replays and listened to each of the two calls.
We'll get your thoughts on Stellar Wind and her performance in a minute, Jonathon, but let's start by talking about the winner, the amazing Beholder. For weeks, you've been talking about making an all-in push on her in the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge. What are your thoughts on the race in general, and talk to us about how you approach the race as a player in the BCBC specifically?
Well, I think that anyone who selected Beholder, who could be bullish on the fact that she won would be a little bit misguided. I mean, look, it was a bob. It was probably a bob that went into the favor of Songbird, but they were neck and neck to the wire. She just happened to be better on the day. So by no means do I think that Beholder is a better horse or anything like that. So I'm not beating my chest. That's my first thing. Second thing is that I was hot and cold back and forth on the issue of what I was going to do in the situation. And what I ultimately did is other things weren't going well for us on the day. We wanted to bet the Windstar horse. I'm going blank now. It's in the juvenile turf, the Good Samaritan. We swung pretty hard on Good Samaritan, so the bankroll kind of was a little bit depleted. I ended up hitting a $50 try with Beholder. Essentially what I did is I keyed Beholder and Songbird in every spot. So it was like a 1-8 with 3, 4, 5, 7 with 1-8, 1-8 with 1-8 with 3, 4, 5, 6. So I essentially needed both of them to run in the exacta for me to hit it. If it would have been anyone other than Forever Unbridled, I would have had it for like $200. But so I won like $5,000, kind of got back into the game, and I could play fully on Saturday, and so that was great. But I didn't really attack it the way that I had kind of maybe at least alluded that I was going to, at least earlier in the fall. To Mike's point, real quick, and I think just in defense of Rona maybe missing that, is I think that when you look at that race on paper and you looked at what could potentially happen in the race as a race caller, as a handicapper, I think that the last thing on the list of important things of the outcome of the race was Stellar Wind's break. I would think that they were concerned about Beholder. Is she going to break and go to the front? Songbird, is she going to get left and break, go to the front? What's going to happen with Chatterbox? Is she going to go with? And if you do that, you go from the 1 to the 8 to the 7 to the 1 to the 8 to the 7. I think it's really easy for you to miss the 5, slow away from the gate. And so I think that's probably why that happened. But nonetheless, it's the fact that it was missed, I think, was a big part of the story.
Yeah, well, let's talk about. We'll deal with Stellar Wind for a second. Obviously, we've got Songbird still to talk about, and I definitely want to spend a bunch more time on this race. But just to deal with Stellar Wind for a second more, Jonathon. I mean, to my view, her race was lost coming out of the gate. And even if you're one of the people who thought that she was the best of those big three, I feel like you can still feel like you were right because she maybe didn't get a chance to show it. Am I making too much of an excuse for Stellar Wind?
No, I don't think you are at all. I mean, I was sitting with a friend of the podcast, Duke Matisse, and who in my opinion has watched more races probably than anyone that I know, especially on a critical level. And he made a great point that on a Wednesday at Aqueduct or a Saturday in a Grade 3, you can miss the break and win the race. But against those fillies, against that talent and a Grade 1 on that stage, you just can't miss the break, cost yourself 2 lengths, and expect to make it up unless you're an absolute super horse. She's a good horse, but I think that super horse is a title that has eluded her.
It's also, super horses is hard when you have two others in the same race you can argue are super horses. Now, maybe that's being too liberal with the term, is what you're suggesting, Jonathon, and maybe you're right, but it's kind of the way I saw the race, is that you had these three grade 1 plus, as I would call them, fillies. Maybe it's really just legitimate grade 1 fillies, as opposed to, let's face it, there are grade 1s throughout the year that I think are won by horses of either sex who you don't necessarily consider proper grade 1 fillies. When you've got two of them lined up against you, anything that goes wrong is going to be tricky. Now let's talk Songbird for a moment. Mike, you were very skeptical of her chances coming in. What are your feelings about Songbird coming out of this year's Breeders' Cup Distaff?
Well, I mean, I guess at the same time she proved me right and she proved me wrong, right? I think from a betting standpoint, my approach was always to take a stab against her at the price that she was likely to be. And I think, what did she open up at, 1-5? Was that what she was for much of the early wagering? Obviously, she drifted up to close to even money, if not even money, maybe even a little above it. But, my approach from a wagering standpoint was exactly what you were saying just a second ago, Pete. We had some really, really, really good, arguably super fillies or mares in Beholder and Stellar Wind. And to have a 3-year-old step up for the first time and compete against them at the price that she was getting bet down to, Songbird would have to be a super filly in order to beat them. She very nearly proved she was, and she may very well be a super filly. She ran huge. She ran a winning race. She lost nothing in defeat at all. And I'm just really excited that we get to see her as a 4-year-old. Word is we get to see Stellar Wind as a 5-year-old. This is a really, really exciting group of older fillies. And Jonathon, I'll agree with what you said about the break that Stellar Wind had. I don't know if she was going to win the race, but she definitely lost the race, and it probably cost her third. And maybe a break like that, she could have won last year's distaff when Wedding Toast was the favorite. You didn't have Wedding Toast as the favorite in this one.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Let's talk about the trips, Jonathon. I'm going to ask you to be extra critical. I know you're a Songbird fan, but is there a reading of this race that she had an easy trip and still didn't get the job done? I'm sure there are some cynical horse players out there. Like I said, I've basically been avoiding social media since the Breeders' Cup, so I haven't seen anybody say that. But I bet they're out there, people talking about how much better Beholder really was, et cetera, et cetera. What's your critical reading of the race when you consider the trips of the top two finishers in the distaff?
I think they both got the trips that they wanted. I think if you're a Songbird guy or girl, that's the trip that you dreamt up when you went to sleep the night before on Thursday night, And if you're a Beholder guy or girl, that was a trip that you dreamt up. So I feel like they got what they both wanted, and I don't think that what Songbird got was necessarily easy, because in my opinion, easy is when you get those fractions and then you don't have to run late. When you get those fractions and you have a 2-time horse of the year and one of the best fillies we've ever seen running at you step for step at the wire, I don't think anyone can say you had an easy race. And she responded. She picked up. It looked like Beholder was going to blow by her. Not blow by her, but looked like she was
going to win pretty easy. Yeah.
Win easily. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't easy at all. Songbird dug in, and I think she proved the people that I know that were against her no one has said, oh, well, she did this. They all said, wow, she proved it. She is as good as everyone thought she was.
I felt that way for sure. I brought that up just to play devil's advocate for a second, but I thought the way that she rebroke late, horse players are such a cynical lot. I heard somebody say, well, didn't Beholder kind of hang late? No. Songbird is this great, undefeated champion who dug in and made it a heck of a horse race in the last 50 yards. That's the way I saw it for sure. And I'd also like to point out that unlike its sometimes reputation, I felt like the racetrack in terms of the paths, and I'll say this over the 2 days of the Breeders' Cup, I haven't gone back and looked at every replay and done the type of work, Jonathon, that you probably have, but I thought it was the type of track where the superintendent did an amazing job, and it wasn't really a disadvantage at all to be a little bit wide. So I didn't feel like Songbird necessarily got it wasn't some inside speed track that she had some ludicrous advantage being on the inside. To me, they just both ran A-plus races, and it was a shame one of them had to lose. Either of you guys have anything else on the distaff before we move the conversation forward?
No.
Sounds like we covered
a lot to cover.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, we won't get to everything. We've got all winter for some of the particulars. For example, let's not go to the end of the year awards in this podcast. We just don't have that much time. We're going to have so much time to talk about that stuff. But if we stick to the Breeders' Cup races themselves, I think we can at least get to the main things we want to talk about, knowing that there's a lot of meat we're going to leave on the bone that we're going to need to chew on during a long winter, if you follow my drift. Let's go to the Classic right away. Incredible race, billed as a match race between Arrogate and California Chrome, and that's exactly the way that it played out on the racetrack. I have some points I want to make on this race, but Mike, let's go to you first, just to give your general opinions of what you saw in this year's Breeders' Cup Classic.
Well, it's another fantastic race. I mean, we billed it as a 2-horse race. It came down to that. I don't think at any point did anybody think that either Chrome or Arrogate was not going to win the race from the moment the gate broke. It looked like it was down between those two. It played out exactly how we all thought it might. And, just the last few strides, Arrogate got the better of California Chrome. I don't know if it's that he's the better horse. I don't know if it was potentially maybe a slightly tentative ride from Victor on Chrome, where he was maybe a little too concerned with the other horse. It almost felt like he was riding 2 horses in the race, if you know what I mean.
It's not fun.
But it almost doesn't matter.
It's not fun to see your jockey. When you bet on a horse or you're rooting for a horse, it's never fun to see your jockey swirling his head around like he's practicing to be the owl at the San Diego Zoo. But I have an opinion about that, and I don't think it mattered at the end of the day. Jonathon, I'm going to ask you specifically about the rides of the 2 top finishers in the Breeders' Cup Classic. What was your opinion, starting with Victor on California Chrome and then going to Mike on Arrogate? I'd like just to hear your opinions as a horse player and a racing fan on the 2 rides.
Well, I thought Mike's ride was brilliant. I mean, I thought he was going to go to the front. I think we argued about it on the show. I think that I don't know if I was the only one. Maybe Pete, you were with me. I think Mike and Matt thought that he would take back. I just didn't see him taking back, and I didn't. It felt like Chrome did what I thought he would do. With Victor broke, stayed in the 4 path, and was always in the 4 path the entire stretch until he realized the Arrogate wasn't going to come. Then he ducked down to the rail and rode from there. I thought Mike's ride was brilliant, and as Mike's rides typically are in those big races, on those big stages. I feel like he does his homework. He understands who's in the race. He understands the horse that he's on. And I thought his ride was great. His ride was great. Victor, look, Pete, we watched enough races together. You've seen me get beat enough to know that one of the things I hate the most is when jockeys are looking around like, just ride your horse. And I get it. Unless you're riding Uncle Mo and it's Saratoga in his debut and your name is Johnny Velasquez, I don't want you looking around. I would prefer for you to go on with it. The only thing that I could say, and if I was going to be critical of Victor, and I don't think it would have made a difference, but there's at least an argument to be made about it. I believe when you have a horse like California Chrome, when you have a horse that's a forward type of horse, I call it kind of the game on dude theory. I think you're better off going on with it and opening up and getting the other horse off the bridle, or making the jock on another horse move earlier than they might think that they need to. That increases your chances, rather than sitting chilly on a horse before you ask and then expecting that you have this forward running horse who's going to now outfinish a horse who's coming from off the pace. And it's the same idea with Beholder and Stellar Wind the first 2 times this year that Stellar Wind beat her. I felt like, yes, Beholder doesn't want to be on the front end, but open up and she would have a better shot rather than riding her to reserve some energy for late. And so that's the only critical part of it. Feels like that was what was going to happen regardless of the outcome. Arrogate's a special horse.
And the last thing you said is where I was going to go. I get what you, I mean, in theory, I agree with everything you're saying completely, Jonathon and Mike. I don't blame you for bringing this up. I mean, Art Sherman himself brought something up similar in the post-race interview. But for me, it all comes down to what was going to happen that was different. And I didn't think Victor was overly conservative. I mean, when you look at the fractions he cut out, it's not like he went so slow he let Arrogate in the race. I felt like the fractions were honest enough, and his horse finished great. And I felt like if he had moved earlier, Mike just would have moved earlier. You guys, in the Lost podcast, actually, you guys made the point to me that Mike Smith knew exactly what he had at every second in the race, whereas my initial view was, well, gee, I wonder if even he thought he was going to be able to get there. Watching it back, I think you guys were right. He knew exactly what was under him the whole time. If Victor had been a little more aggressive, he would have been a little more aggressive. I just don't see it changing the outcome. And so therefore I can't call it a mistake that Victor made. Do you agree with that, Mike?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I said it before when we talked the last time when we lost it. Mike, we might not have known whether Arrogate was going to get there. The way Mike rode Arrogate, it seemed clear to me he thought he was not going to lose the race. And I'm with you, Pete. I don't think Victor moving around cost Chrome the race necessarily, but I'm also with Jonathon. And we'll get to the turf in a second. If you've got the horse that's fastest early and has proven to carry that speed over a long distance against the best horses in the world, just use the advantage. Use speed as your advantage. Open up. Speed is always an advantage in a situation like that when you've got a horse that can go on. I mean, I don't know if it's going to make a difference, and we'll see whether it makes a difference if and when, and I hope they face each other in the Pegasus. But I would imagine Victor will not do the same thing next time.
That's an awesome direction for this conversation to go. And I'm not going to allow it to go there because, again, that's a conversation that, God willing, we're going to be able to have in a future podcast. But I'm glad you teased the idea. One more thing I just have to get off my chest. We talked about it on the Lost Pod as well. But this idea that there was some folks in the camp of one friend of mine in particular who texted me who was of the theory that Chrome might be vulnerable and or tailing off coming into the race. And he had texted me shortly after the race with a little, I think he was just trolling me, but with a little, I told you so. I just can't emphasize enough how great of a race I think California Chrome ran. And you know, he was vulnerable, I suppose, in the sense that he was vulnerable to another tremendous horse running a tremendous race, the same way any horse would be in any race. But I mean, he not only ran his race, if you believe in the Beyer speed figure scale, which of course I do, ran his best race. And when you look at how fast he finished up, I mean, this was not a horse who was tailing off form. This was just a horse who caught an incredibly good horse at a peak effort. And is there any dissent here? Do either of you guys feel like we were wrong in some way and Chrome was vulnerable, or do you more agree with my read of this?
No, I told you on the Lost Pod, and I'll tell you on this pod the same. You probably should block that person.
All right, that's enough on the Classic. Let's move on to some of the other excitement of the weekend. Mike, you mentioned the turf before. Did you have a particular point you wanted to segue to in discussing the turf and the impressive win by Highland Reel?
Well, you leave it to an Irishman and Seamus Heffernan to come over here and show American jockeys how to win on the front end in a turf race. I mean, that was an amazing, and I've said it before. I think, and actually Victor on California Chrome's ride is a perfect example. Jockeys often get too much credit when a horse wins and too much blame when a horse loses. That said, Seamus Heffernan was riding Highland Reel to win the race. And when he opened up on the backstretch on a horse who is proven at grade 1 and group 1 competition and is a proven stamina horse against the top horses in the world, the race was over.
It was very impressive. And I want to say, when we talk about horses opening up, just to clarify, we're not talking about running too fast early or running inefficiently. It's just this idea of being able to continue along at an even pace. We sometimes refer to it. It's not literally clicking off 12s on the clock, but sometimes that seems like a pretty good quick and dirty way of describing what we're asking for. Just looking for horses to run efficiently. If you try to ration the speed too much and go too slow, it can give closers a chance to not be that far back and bring them into the race. When you do what Heffernan did there, and you're not going too fast, you're just going efficiently, and then you've got as much class and talent as that horse has. I agree. The race was pretty much over. I'm sure some folks were convinced it was too early of a move just watching it visually. But when you're familiar with the sectional times, I think those of us who were looking at the sectionals knew, that horse was going to be awfully hard to beat once they hit the far turn.
Right. I think that horses like that are running on the front end, in my opinion, and I've never even ridden. I've been on a horse one time. It was in Puerto Vallarta, and the horse couldn't run at all.
I want to see photographic evidence of that, by the way.
I just feel like with a front running type horse or a forward horse that has class, you're better off asking them between the 3/8 and the quarter pole. Okay. So visualize that, the 3/8 and the quarter, than you are between the 16th and the wire. I just feel like getting into them in that spot when they still have some run left rather than when they're tired. I just feel like that run there is more damaging and more effective than if you wait until the 16th.
Yeah, presupposing that the race has been run efficiently to that point, I completely agree. To me, the story of the race was the amazing Irish team tactics, because I felt bad for Flincher. I mean, you're in a situation, if you're Castellano riding Flincher, I think a lot of people are going to say after the race, oh well, he should have known not to let him go, etc., etc. Well, the horse, I'm pretty sure he's worrying about is the stablemate found. The arc winner handles Highland Reel easily on form behind him. So he's worried if he's the one to attack, he's just going to set the race up for found. So I just felt like it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for Castellano. Jonathon, am I being too easy on him?
No, not at all. I mean, I think you said it that day when we talked about the race. It was a brilliantly run race, and Found ran well. And if for whatever reason, if Flincher would have moved early and attacked Highland Reel, I think it's probably a foregone conclusion of who would have won the race, and I think it would have been Found. So brilliant tactics by like you said, by the Irish. But that's the trip that I wanted for Highland Reel. And when I saw him break and go to the front and then open up, it was unbelievable. Duke Matisse and I high-fived, and we didn't even really bet the race. Like it wasn't like we just had like crushed the race, but it's like as guys who typically need someone to blame for their bad handicapping, and we typically blame on the jockeys. It's like when you get a ride out of someone as brilliant as that, as aggressive as that, as cutthroat as that, when we always are complaining about the passiveness of some of these riders and like they don't look down the form, I thought it was brilliant. It was probably my favorite moment outside of the obvious big two.
That's funny. And yeah, I mean, I made the joke on Twitter, New York horse players should take up a collection to see if we can get Shamie Heffernan to ride at Aqueduct, Belmont, and Saratoga. And I think that's why there's a lot of frustration when you see sometimes it appears jockeys riding races as if winning the race isn't their main priority. This was the antidote to that. And I know Duke Matisse is somebody in that camp of not liking the slow paces in New York turf races. So it doesn't surprise me that he was particularly tickled by that one. And I think everybody here everybody in this podcast has a similar feeling about that. So it was fun to see. I don't know that it'll have any impact because I think there's other factors at play with the way jockeys ride. It's not that they don't know that being aggressive is better, but I think sometimes there's politics involved, and there's not wanting to upset really important trainers who they also ride for. I mean, I do truly believe that's part of it. I mean, do I sound like too much of a conspiracy theorist there to you, Mike, or do you think there might be something to that?
Well, maybe. I mean, obviously, the trainer is saying, look, this is how I want you to ride the race. And it's rare. I mean, we've had examples. I think Kent DeSormo's ride on photo call at Keeneland where he said, no, I'm gonna go to the lead, whether you want me to or not, Todd Pletcher. I think those are the exceptions. So you do get instructions from the trainers on how they want the jockeys to ride. But I think as important as that, it's worth noting that move, going out to the lead, opening up on the backstretch, that is the kind of move that will win races when you've got a proven class stamina router. It's not going to necessarily work on a Wednesday at Aqueduct when you're going to the lead with in a 20K claimer. When you've got a horse that you know is good enough to finish, then absolutely open up. When you're just trying to eke out whatever you can and also maybe not piss off your trainer, then yeah, I can see why it maybe shakes out a little bit differently.
Let's talk about the mile. Tourist gets the job done in the mile, a horse that afterwards I feel very annoyed at myself for not at least having a nickel on in some iteration. But the story of the race for me was Tepin. A lot of people talked before the race like she might be a little bit over the top. It had been a long year with a lot of travel. Boy, she showed her heart, and I felt like, but for the trips, she could have easily been the winner there. Mike, what were your thoughts on the Breeders' Cup mile?
Yeah, it was a great race, and from a betting standpoint, I think there was Tepin, who strangely was not favored for most of the wagering. I don't know if I don't have the chart in front of me. I don't know if she actually went off as the favorite, but the way for me the story was how the race was being bet. Ironicus, we knew he wasn't going to be 8-1, which is what his morning line was, but he opened I think at 5-2, right? There was a lot of money coming around. I think Lamato, actually, I'm looking at the chart now. Lamato ended up going off as the 3-1 favorite. Tepin was 7-2. It was just a fantastic, wide open race. If you thought Tepin was vulnerable, there were 6 or 7 different ways you could go. And Tourist was one of them. But I'm with you, Pete. She lost nothing in defeat. She proved that she has not lost a step. And I'm very, very excited that we get to see her race next year as a 6-year-old. That's
fantastic news that will hopefully come to be. Jonathon, what were your thoughts about the mile, and how did you approach it from a betting perspective?
The mile is one of those races that I was saved by. I went 5-6 in the pick six and got back my investment essentially. There was one of those races that I used Tourist because he was brought to my attention by handicapping conversations with a friend that I really respect. I wouldn't have used the horse, but someone pointed out, made a great case for him, and it was a horse that I included. So, I encourage people to surround yourself with good handicappers and share ideas and discuss, because I used them just because of that. On the topic of Tepin, and, for me, it took me a while. I don't even know if I had realized this idea when we were doing the pods that week, but it took me a while that, in my opinion, Tepin was never cranked this year except for when she went to Aspen. Every other race she ran in was like a stepping stone to something else. She was never, ever, ever cranked, and I felt like they were going to have her cranked for this race. And ultimately, when they left the gate, she was my top pick to win the race. And so I thought she was going to win. She ran well. She didn't do anything to embarrass herself. And how much fun is it that we're going to see her back next year? Mr. Masterson's a ton of fun. And pretty cool that he's going to run her back. Ironicus, our friend Ed DeRosa, he says some silly stuff on Twitter sometimes to get people riled up. But his tweet,
he's a regular Mike Hogan.
He tweeted the other day. That they announced they're retiring him, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he said he had nothing left to prove. According to Trip handicappers, he won every race he raced in, and I thought it was brilliant. So, it was a great race. It was an exciting race. The Europeans didn't really show up. Lamato, what we had kind of heard from Nick Luck, his worry that the stretch out could dull his run seemed to kind of take place, and I don't even remember where Alice Springs finished, but she didn't really show herself either.
Well, let's go back to the pick six comment you made, Jonathon. That was no idle closet redboarding that you're making there. That you were on the simulcast show, called in at the last minute to put up a public pick six play. Talk about that experience first of all, and tell us how it went down.
It was fun. I was lucky enough to get to do it last year at Keeneland, and I was kind of nervous, and I hadn't really done a lot of those types of things before. And my phone was blowing up and my friends were telling me to sit up straight. And, it was this one, I got to do it with our friend Gabby. So it was a little bit, and it was a little bit easier because I felt comfortable with her, like on a personal level, just having, seen her and been around her in different situations. And so, I just went up there and I had just lost out of the tournament. So I kind of had that off of my mind. And I just went up there and it was fun. It was a lot of fun. I wish I would have had Finest City, obviously, because I'd be $200,000 richer. But
that's amazing. So you gave out how big was the ticket you gave out on air?
They asked me to do one between 500 and 1,000, and I think my ticket was 864. 864 using Chrome and Arrogate in the last race. Yeah, it was so 5 of 6. It paid 7. That ticket paid, I think, $770 for 5 of 6.
So yeah, but I mean, still, just to give people the run. Now, who did you use in the filly and mare sprint? How deep did you go, and who did you use?
I used 2. I was 2 deep there. I used Karina Mia and Have You Gone Away.
Yeah, that's what I would have done had the ball been in my hands. So I would have dropped it at the same point. But still, I just thought that was an impressive thing to go up there and do that. And it's a little intimidating. I mean, I was on the simulcast show both days, and you're hearing yourself in the background while you're talking. I got other friends telling me I improved, I think. The first day I was told by several people, don't add that one to your clip file. I think it was obvious I was a little distracted hearing myself in the background. But the second day I felt like I did better. The only tough part being when, I'm sure noticing I was on screen, Tommy Massis decided to call me in the middle of the segment. I appreciate that one.
He did the same thing. He did the same thing to me. I called him when it was over, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't need anything. I was just trying to interrupt you while you're doing this."
With friends like that, who needs enemies? The typical Tommy with his cheekiness. You gotta love it, though. It's such a character. The contest itself was an amazing result. I've written extensively on the site about it. Joe Applebaum of Off the Hook Stables getting the job done. A $13,000 one-way exacta in the Classic. Just incredible, and also interesting. Another just amazing thing we've seen in some other contests where the amount that gets bet because of the contest changes the prices. Not so at the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, certainly not in the exacta pool in the Classic. Still, to my mind, paid a quite overlaid 5-1 on that exacta, enough to get it done. Great story from Charlie Davis, proving my chip in a chair theory about live bankroll tournaments, down to his last 1,000, betting it on the 32-1 shot owned by fellow contest player Phil Bongiovanni, Champagne Room, turning his 1,000 into 32,000, then on the Classic getting that up over 60. You had Bob Traynor trying to become the second 2-time Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge winner. That was a great story. He ended up coming up just a bit short, but was in the hunt. Maybe the best story of all, Vic Stauffer, who had a chance at the $1 million bonus, ends up betting 50,000 on the Classic. Lots of trifectas, I think, some exactas, some win. He really needed Chrome, but was smart enough to construct his bets in such a way where he had a $500 saver trifecta come in, so he still ended up with 37,000 on the weekend. And then, not to be deterred, ends up going to Del Mar this past weekend and winning that contest. I think I got to catch up with Vic soon. He's had quite an eventful year on the handicap and contest scene. Many other great stories as well. Alan Harburg, who was in the hunt late, ended up live to Arrogate, who he loved, in the pick 6. So he didn't win the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, but gets another $292,000 from the pick 6. Not a bad weekend, all in all. Some pretty cool stuff. Any stories that you heard or were interested in particular, Jonathon, to come out of the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge this year?
Well, I think you wrote about Craig Bernick's situation. I thought was interesting.
Tell folks what he did.
What's that?
Tell folks what he did.
Yeah, his initial idea and thought was to bet $50,000 to place on Chrome, but he the minutes to post kind of started to whittle down. I think he began to think that someone was going to bet Chrome to win, and he actually believed that Chrome was going to win. So he felt like if he needed to kind of bet his opinion rather than kind of doing the safer thing. If he would have done the safer thing, he would have won. Hindsight's 2020.
Well, that's the thing. He would have had the total in theory to win, but his theory may have been correct. Vic's tries might have blown him out of the water. My view is that Craig, as a horseman, win or go home kind of guy. You know, he's not there to run second. He's there to win. And I think from a game theory point of view, he actually did absolutely the right thing. It just ends up being kind of unlucky and a terrible beat. But as I say in the column that I wrote about Craig earlier this week on DRF.com, he's a Cubs fan, so he still had a pretty good week overall.
Speaking of Craig, though, we played a game together, Pete. I know we talked about it, and everyone I told about the game thought it was a really cool idea. And it's with a group of guys, and there was 5 of us. And what we did, and Mike, we talked about this after the pod. You guys trying to get you guys to help me. We all put in a certain amount of money.
Jelly beans. You were playing for jelly beans, weren't you?
Jelly beans.
Because that would be illegal otherwise.
It would be. You're right. That's why.
Well, as long as you don't take a rake, I don't know. You know, I mean, if someone's taking a rake, yes, then it's illegal. But if you're betting $5 among friends, you're not gonna get shut down.
That's what it was.
Yes.
Then.
There you go. Yeah.
And the idea was Craig's idea was a great idea. The idea was that every person picked a winner of every Breeders' Cup race. So you picked one horse, you know, Classic Empire, Flincher, California Chrome. You picked one winner of every race. If you won the race, you got a win. You also picked a loser of every race. You picked one horse that could not run in the exacta. If that horse ran in the exacta, you were completely disqualified, even if you won every other race that you picked. A loser was an automatic disqualified with a horse running in the exacta, and whoever had the most wins at the end won all the money. And so it was a really cool thing. It was a lot of fun, like to kind of keep interested and it was good. So
maybe we'll have to bust that out for the podcast on a big racing day. Perhaps get our friend Chris Larmy involved. We'll have a little rematch from the Kentucky Derby shenanigans. That could be fun. That's one to keep in the back pocket for sure.
Surely, I can't remember. I had a few drinks that weekend. Did Mike and I have a head-to-head?
Did you guys have a head-to-head? What was it?
I think we might have. We haven't talked about the filly and mare turf.
Let's talk about that now. That's one of the races on my list. What was the head-to-head you guys had going in? I don't even remember.
I think it was the 2 Euros against the 2 Chads, right? And I think you won by the shortest of noses.
Oh, you know you got a lot of action going on. I don't even remember that.
So Mike, you had Lady Eli and the other Chad against Queen's Khaleesi against Queen's Trust and Seventh Heaven. Well, yeah, I mean that was an incredible stretch run. I mean, great job by Queen's Trust. Fantastic run through the stretch to just pip Lady Eli. Another one of these situations where, that photo, I wasn't sure which way it was going to go. Live, I thought Queen's Trust had it easy. Even watching the slow-mo, I wasn't sure. I mean, talk about losing nothing in defeat. Seventh Heaven, maybe the unlucky horse of the race. Some very questionable stuff, in my view, from Ryan Moore there, asking for speed early, just getting in sort of a strange position, ending up getting blocked. I think if she just ran her normal type of race, the way that the pace was in there and the ability that Queen's Trust showed running late, I think she well could have. I mean, I certainly think she would have been not far off the photo. Let's put it that way. What did you think of the filly and mare turf, Jonathan?
Oh, I thought it was remarkable. I know that we talked about it the next day, Pete, when we went to Lucky Baldwin's for
great
breakfast.
Spot.
And we pulled up the computer and we watched the NBC version, and man, Seventh Heaven's trip was rough.
Yeah, not easy.
But like you said, those 2 fillies with Lady Eli and Queen's Trust, they ran remarkable. But I feel remiss if I didn't acknowledge the race that Avenge ran. I mean,
that was a great
ran
race.
Huge. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking she's gonna stop. She's gonna stop. She's not gonna stop. She's gonna keep running. I don't have her on anything. And then luckily the 2 other fillies came running. But she ran huge.
Yeah, well, Mandela is one of those trainers who just seems to have this incredible ability in getting horses to stretch out and getting horses to stay. The old school training methods do the job, and I agree. That was another. There are really 4 horses that ran, to my mind, remarkable races in there. And yeah, it was sad in a way. The Lady Eli Hollywood ending would have been fun, but obviously for me, from a wagering standpoint, one of the few areas I could really claim a winner over the weekend, just a cold on top winner, was Queen's Trust. So I was grateful for the way it went down, and I don't think that. I think it'd be very hard for somebody to make an argument that Lady Eli is anything other than awesome. Did you have any further thoughts on that one, Mike, before we maybe turn our thoughts to the Juvenile, which I don't want to give short shrift?
No, I think we covered it. And Lady Eli proved she's back. She's another one she was going to sell at auction after the Breeders' Cup. They pulled her. They're going to race her next year, which is fantastic news.
This is the best trend, by the way. I mean, it feels like even just a few years ago in racing, the trend was towards the more, frankly, in many ways, financially forward-thinking decision of retiring these horses, figuring they'd done enough, whatever. But how great is it to be able to see these great horses racing in consecutive years or 3 or 4 years in some instances? It's just it just makes it so much more fun to be a racing fan. And I've just got to believe that, we've had this argument before, in terms of short-term handle, the idea of stars and short-term handle, for me, that's not what it's about. It's just about creating an exciting product that's going to get a hook in people, that's going to carry them into the game and hopefully produce returns for everybody long-term. And I'm just so happy to see the trend that we've had 4 horses that you could have seen, I feel like, in past years would be retired for having done enough, all going to be coming back and racing next year. It's I think it's going to be another exciting year to host a horse racing podcast. At least that's my hope anyway. And not least of what's going to be exciting about hosting a horse racing podcast next year is this pending Triple Crown rivalry. At least that's the way I see it. Great finish in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile between 2 horses who pulled way clear of the rest and both looked extremely serious to me. Mike Hogan, we'll start with you. What were your thoughts on the Breeders' Cup Juvenile?
Well, I think the top 2 were by far the 2 best. I think there might have been ones you could make a case for wanting to bet in the future, but I think those 2, whichever one you want to pick, they're the leaders in the clubhouse right now for the Triple Crown Trail next year. And, Classic Empire, I think, has all but sewn up the 2-year-old champion as well.
Jonathon, you famously have an actual cash, not jelly bean wager on next year's Kentucky Derby, a ticket with not this time's name written on it. How you feeling about that right now?
I feel good. I feel good.
You should.
I told someone on Twitter I'll sell it for $5 right now. Anybody who wants it. I know he ran really well, and someone had pointed out to me before the race, and in fact, in that little game that I did mention we played, I picked Classic Empire. The reason being is I feel like, yes, Dale wants to win the race. Yes, but Dale's not going to crank on that horse to win the Juvenile. Dale wants to win the Kentucky Derby more than anything I think in the world, and I just feel like that horse is going to progress and should be ready to run the first Saturday in May. We also, I went partners with my buddy Jake Ballas on a future on Mastery at 100-1 as well. The Bob Baffert horse that debuted not too long ago. I think he's going to be stretching out coming up soon or running in his next race coming up soon. So that one could be exciting as well.
I mostly, just to give you a hard time, was questioning not this time's breeding for getting the 1.25 miles when the idea of your future bet at 100-1 came up, Jonathon. But I have to say, just watching the horse's tape and the way he finished in the Juvenile, he sure shapes like 1.25 miles is going to be within his scope, doesn't he?
I would think so. I mean, and like I said with Dale, you think about Dale's success in that race, although he's never won it, but horses that have made themselves known in it, Shackelford, Dullahan, Patio Prado.
Yeah.
I felt like there's one more, but those 3 for sure. Him getting that distance, him getting that distance on that track is not a concern for me with his conditioner.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned Keen Ice. He didn't come up with the classic, and with good reason. But props to Mike Hogan for pointing him out as a potential 3rd and 4th key. And fighting the good fight on Twitter against some cynics about the horse being entered in the race as well. What did that try end up paying? Did you that I assume you had, Mike?
I don't. It's funny. I don't know what the try ended up paying, but I do know what the super ended up paying, because one of the things, and I've written about playing the super. One of my favorite plays is what I call the double exacta super, where you take two horses on top and key them over two horses underneath. And I think on one of the podcasts I said I'm going to be playing Arrogate and Chrome over Keen Ice and Opportunity. So I played that a bunch in the super. That super paid just shy of $300, $296 for $1. Yeah. And
that's like stealing. I mean, I know it's easy after the race, but that really does seem like stealing money, doesn't
it? Yeah. No, that was frankly, I'll say it right now. I wasn't right much on the Breeders' Cup, but that saved my weekend.
You can dine out on
Yeah.
that one a little bit. I guess basically just must speak to how bet Frosted was to be in the top four. Does that payout surprise you, Jonathan? Do you think that's the key to it? Was just Frosted running out?
No, I actually don't think it was Frosted running out. I think it was Chrome running second.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that I would imagine that there were some $500, Chrome exacta, situations with him on top. I think there's a lot of money with him on top. And I think that's probably what made the big difference.
It's a smart way to look at the world, really, is to try to figure out. There are certain horses that are, the more you get familiar, especially like on your circuit, but also sometimes on a big day, when you get familiar with the way people tend to bet, to figure out which pool a certain horse is going to be valuing. For example, and I failed to do this because my picks in the other races weren't good enough, but on Friday, I had long made the assumption that the value on Songbird was going to be in the picks, money where, wise guys spending a lot of money. There was, certainly a wise guy sentiment against Songbird in a lot of quarters. I figured, if you're going to be alive to her in the picks, because the win pool, as Mike had said all along, it was going to be very hard to find any value. Sort of interesting to think that in the super pool, the key to it might have been just Chrome not being on top, as close as they ended up being Arrogate and Chrome in the win pool. It is possible you got a little more juice the more rungs of exotics you put into it. We just got a couple minutes left, guys. I just want to go around the table and maybe do a final thought. Obviously, a lot of great racing we didn't even get a chance to mention over the weekend, so feel free to highlight a performance or something you saw on Breeders' Cup Day that you want to talk about, or look forward if you wish. Mike Hogan, we'll start with you. Any final thoughts on this Breeders' Cup recap podcast?
Oh boy, I have a lot. I'm trying to figure out how to just focus in on one. I guess I'll ask this.
Save ones that can be for another podcast, something that you probably wouldn't want to bother with going forward. I'd say hit that now.
We haven't talked about the juvenile fillies. Maybe wasn't the greatest running of the juvenile fillies. I actually did a lot of work on the history of that race and how it is bet. And strangely enough, that race has been won with more favorites than any other race in the history of the Breeders' Cup, but it has also had some of the biggest payouts of any race in Breeders' Cup. And what I found was, this is a long-winded way of getting back to asking a question, but what I found was when there's a legitimate favorite, Songbird, there was that filly the one year that was 1-5, was it Meadow Star? When there's legitimate favorites, they very rarely lose. When it is a wide open race, then long shots are often the ones that end up winning. And I think only 3 out of 140 something winner, 140 runners were in the between 5 and 15 or 20 to 1. Only 3 of them won. There were 7 winners that were over 20 to 1. In the race. So I was just, of course, I didn't think about it till after the race. I didn't mention it on the podcast till after the race. But I think that's a good way to approach a race like that is when there's not a legitimate favorite, it really does open the door up for a huge price. That said, now I'm going to go ask my question. Jonathan, I know we were both very bullish on Yellow Agate. What is your take on her race? Clearly she wasn't good enough, but that was... Of all of the trips, I know it was a slow race and maybe there are no trips and slow races. That might have been the most nightmare trip of any horse I saw in all of the Breeders' Cup races.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
She was clobbered multiple times.
That was the end of you, by the way, for those who don't know, the end of Jonathon in the Breeders' Cup betting challenge was Yellow Agate too, correct?
Yeah. No, I bet 4,000 to win on Yellow Agate, and bet $600 in exactas, weighted exactas, Dutch exactas with her running second. That would have kind of got me my money back. And it was awful. It was an awful trip. It was the worst trip of any horse that I had bet in that scenario. And then that weekend, she just, it was trouble the entire time. I thought she was going to go on with it after she broke so well. She kind of got grabbed back and then got into trouble after she was grabbed back. I'll leave it at that, I guess.
Not a lot to say. I mean, there is that point though that as slow as the race was, I don't know what you can expect going forward. I mean, that's the only point I'll make.
Yeah.
I don't think she was allowed the chance to show her stuff, but I'm not like super excited to bet her back either.
No, but I don't think it was an assembly of great horses in general. So if something can emerge, it doesn't feel like anything in there was our Kentucky Oaks winner. I will say this: a very frustrating part of it was there was a large matchup wager with her versus with Honors that was placed in Vegas, and she was not ridden to the finish and lost the nose to with Honors.
Oh, gross. That's just foul. Jonathon, we'll give you the chance to change the subjects. Any final thoughts on this Breeders' Cup recap podcast?
I think last time I wrapped it up with being excited about how Highland Reel was ridden, and how exciting of a race that was, and I think that the biggest thing for me that I will take from this Breeders' Cup is I sure do love that down the hill race, and that was one that I'm since I've been playing racing, I'm undefeated down the hill in Breeders' Cup turf sprints. I wish they ran every race down the hill. They should have like a down the hill marathon one day where they just run 12 races down the hill. So I thought obviously it was brilliant. What a cool horse he is. He's running 5 Breeders' Cups.
It's amazing.
And finally got a win. And I thought it was pretty special. So good for him and good for the team.
Yeah, I'm a proponent of moving the Breeders' Cup around. I think that's true to what the original concept of the idea was. But I somehow wouldn't mind if you could always just run the sprint at Santa Anita down the hill. Maybe that's a compromise. I'm kidding, of course. All right, folks, that's all the time we have. Mike, you had one other quick thing?
I was just going to say, wouldn't it be awesome if we had like a multi-track Breeders' Cup and you had the classic run at Belmont and you had the mile run at Gulfstream or Belmont where it's a one turn and you had the turf sprint at Santa Anita? That would be awesome. I don't know. Sorry, maybe another podcast just popped into my mind.
That's a good one for a winter day for sure. There's some merit to that from a racing analysis point of view and some real problems from a logistical one. But Mike, keep that list of other things you wanted to talk about. We're going to be back on Friday. Let's the three of us, when we go off the air here, let's the three of us stick around for a minute and talk about schedule going forward. But for now, let's commit to doing a live show on Friday at 11. You can find it in all the usual spots, whether you follow the podcast at SoundCloud, at iTunes, directly from the DRF site. You'll be able to find us. Of course, the easiest way to find the live broadcast is either through Spreaker or through my Twitter feed at Looms Boldly. We'll look ahead. We'll do a little bit of handicapping. I'm going to be pretty plugged in. I'm actually going to be a guest with Dan Illman on DRF Live on Saturday, so I'll probably be a little ahead of the game for the Friday show on handicapping as opposed to where I am some weeks. Looking forward to that appearance with Dan for sure. And so we'll be back then. And till then, I want to thank Jonathon Kinchen, Mike Hogan, all of you for listening, especially the folks listening live, especially the folks who leave us nice reviews on iTunes. Helps other people find out about the show, so we appreciate that. And if you're playing the horses this week, may you win all your photos. 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 Win all your photos.